Each week we have an in-depth conversation with one of the key players in the legislative process. This week we welcome Senator Bryan, a Democrat from Amory. Senator Bryan has served in the legislature since 1984. He's chairman of the Senate's Public Health and Welfare Committee. Senator Bryan, welcome to At Issue.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So as I've just stated, you've been a part of every legislative session since 1984. Considering some of the major issues that have headlined this session, things like Medicaid expansion, education funding, PERS, and public retirement, I know it's a big ask and maybe a hard one to start off with, but how does this session stack up to some of the previous ones?
Well, I was listening to the matters that you suggested, and it appears that the state legislature is dealing with public education, public roads, public health, public retirement, the same issues the legislature was dealing with when I got here, and the same issues the legislature will be dealing with long after we're all gone. That's sort of what state legislatures do and what state governments do, is they focus on things which are very basic and close to the people, and there's just obviously not complete consensus, but there's a lot of consensus around a lot of those topics. I think the greatest change over the past 40 years has been the move from a de facto open process to a de facto closed process. It wasn't that long ago that, as a matter of routine, we had open committee meetings, open conference committees, the conference committees, which is what's going on now, all met in public. We'd meet in a room, talk about bills. In fact, way back when Mark Leggett was a reporter, he wrote a story about the deliberations of the conference committee that was dealing with all the bond bills, which was considered a very sensitive thing. It was all done in public, and people who read the Tupelo Journal, at that time there was a newspaper in Tupelo, read the Tupelo Journal, could read about what was going on. And now all of that happens in secret, and it's not good. One of the reasons it's not good is A, just a matter of principle, but B, not all knowledge is vested within those of us who are in the legislature. They're full of people all over the state the state is full of people who know about things we're considering and have input and can be helpful. And when we operate in public, we get that input from people all over the state. It's very helpful. You don't get that in a closed system, and we make mistakes.
Well, what do you attribute that to, this kind of shift from an open system to a closed system?
Well, I'll say the open system existed when Billy McCoy was Speaker, because Billy fundamentally believed in an open system.
Well, there is new leadership in the House this year, as opposed to the previous, I believe, 3 sessions under the leadership of not 3 sessions, but 3 terms, 3 4-year terms under Speaker Philip Gunn. Are you seeing any differences across the building in that chamber when it comes to transparency and openness?
Well, too soon to tell, and I don't think it's fair to judge Jason White as Speaker at this point, because he's just barely getting his feet wet, as it were.
Do you think this conference week is going to be kind of a moment to kind of paint him one way or the other?
I think that in all fairness, and I'm personally very fond of Speaker White and wish the best for him, and I think he's got a great opportunity. And I'm trying to figure out how to say this. I think we'll know more about Speaker White and how he does in the next year than we do now, simply because everything's new. And I'm hoping I'm saying this in the right way, but whenever anyone's doing something new, they need a while to sort of see how things work. And the view is always different from when you're sitting in the chair and when you're sitting down looking up at the chair. But I think Speaker White has a great opportunity, and I hope that all goes well with him. As you may or may not have mentioned, I'm chair of public health in the Senate. Representative Creekmore is the chair of public health in the House. I enjoyed very much working with Representative Mims the past 4 years as my counterpart. I'm enjoying working with Representative Creekmore as my counterpart. So I've had good dealings there, and that's been very pleasant.
It's an interesting kind of segue to talk about Medicaid expansion. Representative Creekmore was added as a conferee from the House when it came down to the conference committee for Medicaid expansion, but the Senate, even as chair of Public Health and Welfare, which is not this, there is a Medicaid chair, that's Kevin Blackwell, but even as chair of Public Health and Welfare, you were not asked to be a conferee. In fact, all 6 conferees are Republican. So as we enter that very significant conference, what's your take on the makeup of that body?
I'm not a member of the Medicaid committee, so traditionally I would not be considered as a conferee. Having said that, I don't know that the partisan makeup is all that particular concern. I would look more at the individuals than anything else.
Okay.
But if you're talking about Medicaid expansion, I would say most of the Democrats are the free squares and the bingo card. And so if you're trying to pass something, you would need to develop a proposal that could get a sufficient number of Republican votes to pass. Maybe that had something to do with it. I certainly don't have any complaint about the conferees. I think the difficulty is figuring out where the votes are on the floor of the Senate to pass Medicaid expansion and what provisions would be necessary to get the votes. I think the governor has been talking to people in the Senate, and of course, the governor opposes Medicaid expansion, and he made it very clear during the campaign that he opposed Medicaid expansion. And
he's made it clear since as well.
He has, and I've looked into this, and it appears that he won the election fair and square, and he's going to be governor for 4 years. So the governor will oppose this issue, and there you are.
Well, the Senate's proposal during the regular bill and amendment process did not include full expansion. Expansion light is the term that was floated around. Had a work requirement, did not go up to 138% of the federal poverty level that would kind of qualify for full expansion. Now, as we enter conference, we put the conferees and who's doing the deliberation aside. What if you could have your druthers, what would the expansion plan that comes out of conference look like?
Well, it's irrelevant what I would like to have because you have to have apparently 2/3 votes in both chambers, assuming the governor will veto something he disapproves. And the question is merely what can you get a sufficient number of votes in the Senate to override a veto on? And there are people trying to work on that. I would have, like 15 years ago, just expanded Medicaid like the majority of states did from the word go and been done with it. But we've not done that.
Is there, based on things that are going on in the Senate, is there a place to go beyond what passed the Senate? Is there any wiggle room, or is that 100% work requirement kind of a red line in the sand from what you're hearing in your chamber?
Well, again, I hate to say the same thing over and over. The question's what can you get 37 votes for? And I think that may be the issue more than the merits of the particular provisions.
Okay. Education funding has also been a hot topic this session. You were one of the architects, if I'm not mistaken, for the Mississippi Adequate Education Program, a way to objectively fund schools. The House has looked to pass legislation, or is still seeking to pass legislation that would do away with the MAEP in favor of a separate formula. It does not include an objective component. So, as someone who's been in the legislature from the beginning of MAEP through the trials and tribulations of the body not being willing to fully fund MAEP to now this proposal from the House, in some characteristics out of nowhere to change it. What is just kind of your overall take on all of this?
Well, first of all, the House proposal is a rehash of something that was rejected about 5 years ago, however long it was, and it's the same thing that happened last time, just out of the clear blue sky. There was some formula that the House demanded that we pass without any public input or debate or anything, and the Senate did not do that 5 years ago, whenever it was. But to talk about the existing funding formula, if we could just for a minute.
Sure.
There were two concepts going on at the time. Public education in every state, except Hawaii, which just has one school district, in every state depended on, to some extent, local property taxes. And as you go from school district to school district, the amount of local property taxes you collect per student varies based on the property wealth of the district. That's not necessarily the same as the economic wealth, although there's a good bit of correlation. So there got to be a concern nationwide that districts without much property just couldn't get the money that richer districts could get, no matter how many mills they levied. And there grew a movement based on equity, which at its core said the amount of money each district gets per child ought to be equal. And one response to that was, well, we can certainly reach that easily. We'll just go find the most underfunded district in the state and confiscate any funds any other district has in excess of that, and we'll all be equal. It'll be mighty poor, but we'll all be equal. And so apparently others looked at that, and there got to be an adequacy movement, which, again, some of this was based on lawsuits in state court, not in federal court, because this is not a federal issue. But there were state court decisions about what is or is not an adequate education. And they would use terms like sufficient to be able to be a good citizen, to earn a living, whatever. But in Mississippi, we had a accreditation system run by the State Department of Education, and there was an accreditation which was standard accreditation, which, among other things, required you to offer certain courses and had certain limits on class size and all of that. So we adopted standard accreditation as what we would consider adequate. And so the question then becomes, if this is the education that we're going to guarantee to each student in the state, we need a funding mechanism so that each district will have enough money to provide that basic accreditation. And so what we did was we, first of all, answered the question, well, how much does that basic education cost? And then eventually you come up with a per student amount. There are a lot of different ways to determine that. People have suggested do X, Y, change this, change that. You keep coming out with about the same dollar amount. So you have the amount of money that each district needs. And then we required a local contribution of 28 mills. Almost every school district in the state was levying at least 28 mills of local property tax. So your local contribution was 28 mills. And you'd compute, say this district needs $10 million from their 28 mills. They're getting $1 million. So the state will write them a check for $9 million, and they'll have $10 million. If you go to an identical district next door, which could get $2 million from the 28 mill levy, then the state would write them a check for $8 million. So at least for the basic amount of funding, those two districts would be equal. We did not restrict any district from getting additional funds. If you levied mills above that, you could keep it. We did not take money away from any district directly or indirectly. But we had a system which, with a relatively small amount of additional state funds, phased in over 6 years, by the way, we gave to the poor without robbing from the rich. We took money from the state general fund. And that was the first time that there had been a funding formula that took into account property wealth at all.
Okay.
Governor Fordyce vetoed the bill, and the legislature overrode his veto. The funding formula was worked on for years in public with hours, days, weeks, months, years of public discussion. Various proposals were considered. And so by the time we adopted this, every school district in the state that cared to, the business managers of the schools who know how things work, all of those individuals knew what the formula was, what it did, what the implications were for the district in the future. And we had, I'm assuming, unanimous support across the state. It was supported by all the districts.
Okay. So since then, there has been a failure. I mean, for lack of a better word, for the legislature, from the legislature to fully fund the formula that was passed into law. I believe only twice in the lifetime of the MAEP. So being in the building all that time, what can you attribute to kind of, the body passes this formula and then neglects to meet the obligations for all those years? Like what can you reflect on as from your experience in that chamber during that time?
We have these elections every 4 years. And the legislature today is not the same legislature that enacted the formula. The formula was funded for the first 6 years. It was phased in. There's a 6-year phase-in period. And it was funded those first 6 years, and it was fully funded. After that, we had severe financial crises, and I think the formula is funded at something like 99% of full funding, which seemed to me, given everything else that was going on with the budget that year, was not that serious a deal. But in more recent years, when clearly we've had money, the legislature has chosen to spend money elsewhere or to cut taxes, primarily for out-of-state corporations and the Waltonaires. The Waltonaires are coming out mighty good on these tax cuts they've gotten. I'm sure they're going to leave Bentonville or wherever they are and drive around the state and spend all their additional money on dry goods, and we'll get it all back in sales tax or something. But last year, the Senate passed a bill which, with minor modifications to the formula, would fully fund the formula. The House refused to spend that amount of money on public education, with all the money in the world. And so we're back this year, and this year the House is willing to spend money, so they say, for 1 year, but only if we take away any objective formula to determine how much money the schools need. And so the clear implication, and sometimes they'll actually say it, is the proponents of this new formula wish to be relieved of the obligation to fully fund education, and they won't have to listen to that sort of talk anymore.
And that their proposal would be just to get a recommendation from a committee every year that they could then accept or deny.
I have no idea where it's going to come from. It's a number made up out of whole cloth. But apart from this very significant feature that they're decoupling the amount of money the schools they get from the requirement that the basic formula provide what's required for basic accreditation. Obviously, the intent is not to give the districts enough money for basic accreditation. And if you look at the existing formula and compare it to other states, it certainly hasn't gotten Mississippi off the bottom in per student funding. But the other problem with this new formula that they came up with is there was never any public discussion about it. As I say, a group of people got in a room with no windows, no doors, and no incoming phone lines, and then suddenly the formula leapt full grown from the head of Zeus, and there you were with a demand that it must be passed. Some of the groups that are supporting this, to say the least, are not longtime proponents of public education. You have those funded by the Koch brothers. You have Americans for Prosperity, Empower Mississippi, Center for Public Policy, whoever they are, whatever their names are, that group of people who are hardcore supporters of vouchers, who are supporting this. And there is some reason, which apparently at least some people in the legislature can't figure out, there's a mighty good reason why the people who support vouchers support this formula, because it is a step toward having vouchers to replace public schools, which is clearly the goal of a lot of people.
You brought up something in this conversation about having elections every 4 years and how the body that passed the MAEP is not the same body. I've heard you use the same point. That we have elections and that we elect people to serve in the legislature. When discussions about the ballot initiative have come up and restoring it, all intents and purposes, any restoration efforts are currently dead. But where do you sit on the legislature's role in restoring the ballot initiative?
Well, I think the interesting thing about ballot initiatives just generally is everyone says if we only had initiative, then obviously we could pass this proposal, which I think is good legislation. And so we need initiative. And they never stop to think, there are another group of people that might not look at it that way. And so there might be a bunch of initiatives that you wouldn't be all that carried away with. There is the question of why, if there is a public issue that people support, they don't simply elect legislators who would support that public issue. That would be the simple way to get from point A to point B. Having said all that, if it were up to me, I would enact or I would support a constitutional amendment to reestablish the initiative. I would have an initiative for statutes, not for constitutional amendments. I would have a high but not impossible, not ridiculous. I would have a high number of signatures, but something that obviously could be obtained. And I would have no more than maybe 2 initiatives on the ballot at any time just to avoid confusion. But I would support and do support something that would be a workable initiative where individuals could put issues on the ballot, and if they pass, they would become part of the law of the state. I support that.
And that, I know you're not a mind reader, but I mean, at least you can kind of use some wisdom to deduce this. But I mean, what is it about the electorate to where there are all these popular initiative items over the last 6 to 8 years, funding the MAEP, medical marijuana. Before it was struck down, Medicaid expansion was on its way to becoming a ballot initiative. Where's the disconnect between the electorate seemingly favoring these issues but not voting for representatives that champion them?
I'd rather talk about your introduction. You said that I was not a mind reader.
Yes.
And then you used the word wisdom. Mm-hmm. Somewhere in that I think you're calling me wise. I'm not sure that that's true, but at least it's flattering.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think one of the things that happens in elections is people get distracted by the hot button motion issue of the moment. Mm-hmm. And we first started and discussed that, when I arrived, we were talking about roads and schools mm-hmm. and healthcare, and we're still talking about roads and schools and healthcare because that's the function of state government. Those a part of the core function of state government. Those issues are not going to go away, and they are the things that really matter long run. But there was a time when the lottery issue just had everybody tied in a knot, and the time we had the misfortune to have the newspaper in Jackson that we had at that time, who just devoted endless amounts of news coverage and inaccurate editorials about lottery. And in fact, since we're speaking of the Clarion Ledger of that era, there were 27 of us in the Senate who voted no on the lottery, and they ran an editorial which had a picture of the 27 of us, and it said "clip and save," and the Clarion Ledger said you should vote against these 27 people because they voted no on the lottery, as though that was more important than every other issue put together. Now, for those of us who sort of keep up with the Clarion Ledger, several years before that, they had written an editorial denouncing the lottery and saying it was a bad idea. And then when it came time to vote on it, they wrote an editorial saying everyone should vote no, although it's really important to have this vote, but it's a bad idea, you should vote no. Also, warming to this topic, among the people that had voted no on the lottery who should have been defeated for that purpose were Ronnie Musgrove and Roger Wicker, who were later endorsed by the Clarion Ledger for governor and United States senator. So apart from having fun evening the score with the Clarion Ledger from 30 years ago, seriously, talk to people. It was just, everybody was just energized about the lottery. And in the overall scheme of things, if you're for it or against it, it ain't that big a deal. And I think that's some of the things that happens in elections is there's some issue that either is important or is said to be important, and people focus on that as one does, particularly if that's what you're hearing about on the radio and TV and newspaper, when we had newspapers. That has an impact.
And it's still sticking on election. Like you represent parts of Monroe, Lee, and Itawamba counties, rural counties in northeastern Mississippi. Those areas have leaned heavily red in recent elections. In this most recent Senate primary, Lee and Itawamba County voters favored challenger Gannon Burton, who ran further to the right than incumbent Roger Wicker in that senatorial primary, Republican primary. So this is an area you've served for 40 years now as a Democrat. How are you able to appeal to voters despite having that D next to your name in an area that is seemingly leaning further and further red or right?
Well, there's a reason we have statewide elections in years other than federal elections, and that is none of us can control what they do in Washington. I tell people I don't have anything to do with that. I was at a meeting once, and there was someone there who was the Secretary of Health for the state of Michigan. And at that time, Michigan had a Republican governor, and he said, I generally am the Secretary of Health when there's a Republican governor, and there's another guy who does this when there's a Democratic governor. But he said, when I go to talk to the Republican governor of Michigan about health care, all he ever asks me is what's best for Michigan. We don't ever talk about any of these big national issues or anything, because they don't control that. You're the governor of Michigan. You can't decide what Congress does, but when Congress and the federal government enact a law, we just look at it and see what's best for our state. And so I think that's the role all of us play, is a lot of the partisan stuff plays out on the national level. We don't have anything to do with that. All of us should simply focus on whatever they do in Washington, good, bad, or indifferent. Let's take that and figure out what we can do with that that'll help people in Mississippi the most. I think that the people in the district that I represent care about public education. They care about public roads, care about public health, and those are the things I care about. And I think having worked with people over the years and fought battles together, and when you work with people, you build interpersonal relationships and all of that. So I'm very honored to be elected from the district. I try to do a good job as a state senator and try to keep in touch.
All right. Well, I'll leave it at that. Senator Bryan, thank you so much for joining us on At Issue. For an extended version of my interview with Senator Bryan, please subscribe to our At Issue podcast.